Welcome to Quick to Listen. I'm joined here by David Cope, who is Dickerson Emeritus Professor at UC Santa Cruz, where he teaches theory and composition. David Cope is an accomplished composer. He's released 9 symphonies, 6 quartets, 4 piano sonatas. He's written 4 novels, 2 books of short stories. He's best known for his pioneering work in the field of virtual music. He's the inventor of Experiments in Musical Intelligence, EMI or EMI, and a follow-up program called Emily Howell, which, in a nutshell, allow one to input a database of music, say a bunch of Chopin mazurkas, and output a new Chopin mazurka. If you want more of the basics of what on earth that is, pause the podcast at this moment and go read or listen to one of Professor Cope's other interviews, because the basics have been explained, and with this interview, I don't intend to repeat that. I want to get more into the philosophical implications of this work, which Dave has explored himself quite consciously in the book Virtual Music, amongst others. And I intend to learn more about how this has affected Dave's worldview. David Cope, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure indeed.
Let's talk about semantic satiation. In Tinman, actually this is in Tinman too, you give a childhood memory of listening to your mother, who was a piano teacher's students practicing for Elise. And
oh God, yes.
And then hearing later in life your wife's students practicing the same song.
Yeah.
And you say, I'm not sure I even know the right order anymore.
Yeah.
And then in 1980, you famously had writer's block while working on an opera, and you said, referring to that, I didn't know what the difference was between a C sharp and a C natural.
Right.
Is there a truth in semantic satiation?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I would actually wrestle with the term a bit, in the sense that I don't think you end up without meaning when things are repeated to that extent. I think you end up with new meanings, that you grant these bits of music or text or whatever. It's just sounds that one hears, new meanings. Now, of course, we tend to subjugate those to our subconscious after a while, because otherwise we'll probably go crazy. But nonetheless, our minds include the subconscious, and thus I think that the these bits and pieces of things, or maybe whole things occasionally if they're short enough, we somehow stamp them with continuously changing meanings that can, in fact, reverse even the original meaning, if there is one, as I don't think there is, particularly in music, but we'll let that be for the moment.
Tell us how you handled that 1980s writer's block.
Well, there we get into what you said we weren't going to get into, and that is I created a program after a lot of mistakes, a computer program that would emulate the style of the music in its database, which I hoped would be my own music, and then produce new music that would be in the style of that database music, but not absolutely replicate it in any exact way.
And that was the program called EMI.
Right. Or Experiments in Musical Intelligence.
What happened to EMI in 2004?
Well, I retired her. I didn't destroy the program. I destroyed the databases because it took so long to create them, and stopped using it. I had been, I'm a composer, author, programmer, artist. and a variety of other things. And I wanted to do those things rather than just be commissioned to do to finish Schubert's Unfinished Symphony or Beethoven's Tenth or a Mahler opera or 1,000 other things that people were very interested in hearing. I was interested in hearing them too, but I'd spent a great deal of my life at something I'd not planned to spend it at. Not a good sentence, but nonetheless the meaning, I hope, gets transferred. And I wanted to get on with things, not only things that related to me artistically, but also programming different things, different kinds of programs, operating on different principles and so forth.
The Guardian piece on you, in which I read about the retirement of experiments in musical intelligence, put it rather differently in a way that seemed kind of uncopian. So I'd like to know if they mischaracterized it.
Well, I don't read or listen to interviews of me or read interviews of me or comments about me. So this will be news to me.
They implied that you had an insight that part of what makes the work of a composer affecting is the finitude, that they die in the end, and so you to give the sort of a poignancy, implied poignancy and an arc to her output.
Right. Well, that's a rather romantic view of it that I wouldn't particularly take, but yes, that actually is true in the sense that one of the things that kept many rather famous, well-known performers from performing the music was that, Emmy was a font of endless supplies of music, and so why should they, perform one particular Mozart-like sonata when a better one could pop out of the program, tomorrow or next week or next year. But if there were a supply of, let's say, 1,000 pieces that were like a regular composer, that particular composer's lifetime production, that then they would make a choice of which one they wanted to play, because there was a limited number of choices to make.
We'll talk now about one of the pieces produced by Emily Howell, which is a successor program to Experiments in Musical Intelligence. But first, what is Emily Howell and how does she operate differently?
Okay. Yeah. Well, I use the word her, so I'm perfectly happy if you want to too. She is essentially, Emmy Experiments in Musical Intelligence was designed to replicate music in styles of dead composers, and dead because there's less likelihood that they will sue you for stylistic copying. Emily Howell is different in the sense that her purpose is to create music in new styles. And to do that, she uses the database of the entire production of Experiments in Musical Intelligence, Emmy, as fodder for her new compositions. So in the case of Emmy, the program, I would build a database for the program that essentially is very consistent in a particular composer's instrumentation and style for a particular, let's say, slow movements of a Mozart sonata. Whereas with Emily Howell, she's using the entire output of of Emmy's 1,000 published works, and in so doing is mixing styles constantly, and this produces sometimes rather horrible output, but mostly quite intriguing at the least, and sometimes I think quite musical.
We'll listen now to an excerpt from Shadow Worlds, which is Emily Howell's Opus 2 for 3 pianos and 4 movements. So that people can get a comparison, we'll play another excerpt from Shadow Worlds now. If style, as you've said before, is all of the things that 2 different works by the same composer have in common, how would you describe the style that unifies the 4 movements of Shadow Worlds?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and I'd have to go back. I haven't heard the piece in probably I don't know, 10 years. So I'm at a loss for coming up with something salient about it, except to say that it's different from a number of perspectives. Of course, difference is a question that's difficult to define in this circumstance. How different is it? Well, it's not so different that it would strike people as not music if they were familiar with music of 20th century classical varieties. In other words, it shares things with other composers, Stravinsky, Schoenberg, Bartók, and so forth. But it, at the same time, it is different in other respects. And whether that's enough to create in some minds and some listeners' minds the sense of a new style is certainly up to them. But I'll admit that it is something which shares, and since it's only Opus 2, there's not much to go on in terms of sharing with itself or creating a new style that way, because Opus 1 is quite different, triadic, and more or less minimal in nature. Compared to Opus 2, which is, as you played here on your show, a quite different, more dramatic, and more dissonant kind of music, obviously using different works from the ME database.
I noticed that symphony-like, the second movement is quietist. the third is it's much more abstract than something in the classical style, but it's most dance-like, and the fourth is the most restive and agitated and upbeat. Am I projecting onto it when I hear these correspondences between the movement designations and classical forms?
Well, in some ways, maybe. I selected the movements and the order of the movements in what felt comfortable to me. And since I'm a classically trained musician, certainly my own bias had a great deal to do, well, had everything to do with that order. So don't ascribe that to the program. It had no idea it was writing a four-piece, four-movement work. It just produced what it produced. The whole idea of projecting yourself onto and your own interpretation of things onto music is a very relevant comment to make, because essentially, unlike literature, music has a very shall we say tenuous relationship with semantics. They both literature or writing have syntax in common. There's no question about that. Even music which is in a new style has syntax, in the sense that it sets up almost immediately, as you begin to listen, a kind of syntactical relationship between events that occur, and then when events occur in strange orders, that's something different as it appears in a piece later on. But for me, the wonderful thing about music is that it doesn't have some kind of dictionary-like meaning to look up and to relate to, and that we are able, each of us, to determine that meaning for oneself. And this is the most, I think, or one of the most, extraordinary things about music that separates itself from the visual arts and the literary arts. And I cannot understand why people are, don't follow my logic in this, which to me appears faultless. Certainly, if we all hear a minor tonality, slow movement for strings, it's really hard to not imagine that everyone hearing this doesn't feel much the same way, and therefore there's a common kind of reaction and understanding of the quote unquote meaning of a particular passage or a movement. But at the same time, one can look around in various cultures of the world, and I've done that, and found that people of different cultures on different continents with different backgrounds relate to the music in a very, very different way than we do. And we in the Western world, who are used to a certain kind of, are used to being programmed by the music we hear into believing that that's what it represents. As a composer myself, I know that some of the saddest things that I think that I've ever created are listened to in a very and interpreted as very happy often. And I know throughout history, composers have written, extraordinary pieces of music that we all relate to, but they were joyously happy as they wrote this supposedly extremely sad music. So if you're thinking of a one-on-one correspondence between what the composer intended and what the listener received, there is very little in common there. So, the whole idea of meaning in music. I mean, to me, as I've said often, the wonderful thing about music is that it has no meaning. Now, of course, that is misinterpreted as having no meaning in terms of value. That's not the case at all. I mean meaning in the sense of its dictionary clarity, meaning that there's an actual transfer of precise information from the composer to the listener. I think that, and hope to God that's not the case.
Jonathan Berger invented a sort of companion to EMI called Experiments in Musical Listening.
Yes.
And he wrote about it in your collection, Virtual Music. He said the essence of creativity lies in the act of listening, and he developed something that attempted to break down these semantic patterns that are relied upon by listeners to make meaning. Can you give us, he obviously, his discoveries, he doesn't speak for you, but can you give us some of his insights into how humans listen for meaning?
Well, I think I already have, in the sense of slow, tonal, minor key, strings, low register, orchestration. I mean, there's all kinds of things that we've heard in films, in elevators, in doctors' offices, dentists' offices, and so forth, that provide for us a kind of calm or non-painful musical experience to offset whatever we're going through otherwise. I don't get down to the level of this interval, this note, this kind of passage that listeners may or may not have heard before that one can relate to. But I think what he's overall insinuating, actually, I think he's overall saying, is that in the case of music, we give the composer more credit than he or she deserves by suggesting this communication takes place, where the real action is occurring in the listener, and I subscribe to that very much.
You have embraced the haiku form and have released a book with 2,000 haikus, some of which were written by Emily Howell, and some of which you wrote. And
no, I didn't write that the program wrote.
Oh, they were entirely written.
Oh, yes. I didn't touch a one of the haiku in that book. Yeah.
Well, you know that you left it deliberately ambiguous. It says written by man and machine.
Oh, well, no, the man and the machine in that particular instance the man was the original Japanese haiku, classicists who produced it in the first place, and then the translators who were human, not as a reference to the haiku that was machine composed or machine created.
I love haiku, and I think that one of its functions, to put it reductively, is that they often help break us out of our semantic, our straitjackets of meaning and cultural connotation, of hearing this and thinking, oh, I heard this in an elevator and it makes me, relates to this memory. They're often an observation of a moment in nature that is ambiguous in some profound, basic way.
Well said. I agree.
Well, let me read a couple of them. Perhaps you can give your reflections on them if you have any.
Okay.
Comes the fiery night when all those gone return, none the brighter for it. What is that?
What does that mean?
Yeah, I'm going to ask a deliberately ridiculous question, an unfair question. What does that mean? What does that mean to you?
A ridiculous and unfair answer. I have no idea what it means. It's the choice of words and the brevity, the fact that it concentrates on a very narrow idea of potentially, though it doesn't use the word, reincarnation of some kind, makes it intriguing. It makes you want to read it again. You read it again and you get a slightly different interpretation, and you read it again yet, and maybe a little less abrupt change in meaning to you, but maybe get a little more out of it. And I think you start to lose, at least I do when I read it over and over again, since I have read that one over and over again, because it is the first line is the title of the book, as I recollect. The notion of really looking at something closely, something very tiny, but yet in a sense very large. One can get a handle on something by narrowing it down to whereas you can say that, for one moment I left that thought and I've returned to it none the wiser. I haven't any more idea now than I had before, and thoughts are thoughts. Maybe there's no meaning in them at all, but in this particular case, the poem is saying there, at least as far as the protagonist that we imagine the poem speaking of, is no wiser for having gone through thinking about it than he or she was when first reading it.
Isolation never hurts those who follow its way, or so says the bear.
And again, I have no clue what that means, specifically, objectively, literally. I like the way the words go together. I like the poetry of it. I mean, remember, poetry is that art form which is in between literature and music. It's perfect, and it's right in there with dance, where we have the musical aspect, but then a semblance of meaning in the manner in which the performers display the music visually and of course physically for the audience. And I see it the same way. In other words, I don't see explicit meanings coming from poetry. I see many, many meanings, which as you read it over and over again, become less in number, but never exact. You never come up with one at the end. You still come up with at least two, if not more. But you start with 50. And it's so open-ended in the first reading. And that over and over reading of that poem out loud to yourself, to others, just hearing it, not reading it, are all like leaves from an artichoke as you peel it slowly off to get to the heart. In haiku, you never really get to the heart. You get most of the leaves off, or most of the layers like an onion off, but never really find the kernel of truth that's there. You more or less feel it than understand it or can give it meaning by other words. And in fact, I think all great poetry is such that the same thing occurs, that there's a moment where you undeniably realize that you can't say it any other way than it's saying itself. That is, and once you realize that, you realize the essence of the poem is the poem itself, and the choice of words and so forth. And it's not something that you can translate, as you could say a novel or a short story, or that you couldn't do in a piece of music without even a small translation is considered a mistake, and you can hear it, but you don't have any idea what it means. You only know that it belongs there, even if you've never heard the piece you're listening to before. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Well, good.
On this note, The experience of stargazing and losing oneself in natural landscapes recurs throughout your autobiography. I hear this in your work, too. Emily Howell allows us, I believe, to experience the patterns that human composers have come up with more impersonally as feats of nature.
That's great.
I don't even want to go there, but of course some people are very, frightened or offended, or at least pretend to be, about impersonality as it relates to the human mind and to the great human achievements like the symphony. And they recoil at the idea of it being impersonally presented, yet they achieve profound aesthetic solace from looking at a natural vista which has not had a guiding hand in its creation, I dare say. And because humans are the input in all of your algorithmic work, I feel appreciative of humanity, and I am able to appreciate it in this impersonal way, knowing that there is not it's not programmatic music.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure there's a question in there, and I would just simply applaud you. I think that's a wonderful way of looking at it, and I wish others would have the same feeling. I mean, I've always said that, to me, looking at a particular sunset or rainbow, or just staring down into a clear stream of water in the mountains, is an artistic experience. I mean, I truly believe that it is. I think that our attempts to associate creativity with exclusively human touches reduces our ability to respect and appreciate the universe in which we live. I mean, it's an extraordinary place, and to try to differentiate between what we make and what the universe makes is rather pointless to me, because we are a part of the universe. We are an integral part of the universe, and music created by machines, which, by the way, were created by human beings in the first place. So it's just sort of one step removed, if you even want to consider it that way. I mean, in a sense, since we program those computers as well, they're not acting on their own. They're acting at our command. There really isn't any difference. But assuming, for the sake of the argument here, that they are different, and that we have to take the machine's output more or less like the sunset, that is, it is distant from us, we're not creating it, something else is creating it, that it therefore is of lesser value or non-artistic, is patently insane as far as I'm concerned. I guess I feel more secure about the human place in the universe than many are, who want to ensure we have a special place in it by defining certain things like art and literature and music as special, that couldn't be created by nature. The need to do that is built on a kind of disbelief in what they're trying to prove, which is that we're special. And I just don't see why why our purpose is to make that so. I mean,
there should be nothing to prove.
Nothing to prove at all. And when I'm often criticized by people in doing what I do, in the sense that I'm somehow negating or at least contributing to the lesser human value in things, when in fact I think if anything, I'm underscoring it by the mere fact that not only can we create art with computers, but we can create good art with computers, and this somehow is superior to just making art. Although I argue with myself constantly that we are ourself algorithms. Our DNA is an algorithm. Our breathing is an algorithm. Our senses are algorithms. Our reaction to things are algorithms.
In your book, Virtual Music, Daniel Dennett writes, life on Earth has been generated over billions of years in a single branching tree, the tree of life by one algorithmic process or another.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And so what we're doing now is creating algorithms to create music. It seems so natural, and it seems to underscore the importance of humanity rather than degrading it or in some way refusing to admit it. And I just don't understand the problem.
I think it is undeniably so natural. A lot of people's spiritual orientation is uncomfortable with the natural, of course, and I think that's that's exactly the people's problem.
Yeah. Well, I tend to simplify things most of the time in my life, particularly as I get older, and lately I've taken the view that life in the raw, life as we see it throughout its entire forms of existence, from worms to people to what have you, really comes from one source, and that is survival. It's a single word: survival. Survive above all. And when we look at most of the animals besides ourselves, that seems to be their guiding principle, and it's certainly part of us as well. But then when I come down to intelligence, it's more difficult to define, and as you discover, anyone discovers who looks into artificial intelligence, nobody could yet define the word intelligence. My single word definition of intelligence is curiosity. And whenever we find fault with our own curiosity, we're finding fault with our very existence. And I suppose it's a different way of saying what we've just said, and that is that one of the kinds of curiosity that we have as intelligent beings is, what makes us interesting? What is it that we have that we can contribute to the next generation of life? Because certainly we're not the end of evolution. It's going to continue, and it's continuing right before our very eyes, with the importance of thumbs suddenly in modern day technology, in texting and so forth. So to make a long story less long, I just do not understand why people don't see what's so obvious in front of their face.
I'd like just to give people an insight into a little bit of the process of how you guide the evolution of an Emily Howell piece. I'd like to hear an example of that. I'll frame it with this quote by Daniel Dennett, but it's about the work of Karl Sims, who created evolved virtual creatures in the mid-90s, which are these, probably people have seen, they're these blocky polygonal things that learn to move and scrape along on their own and basically evolve to get to food and do basic tasks. Quote, when Sims wanted to see if his creatures could evolve phototropism, which is seeking out light, he had to reach in godlike and add the genes for a photosensor element, increasing the dimensionality of his simulation. Can you give an example in one of your Emily Howell pieces of where you have reached in?
Well, I mean, again, Emily Howell works on different principles than experiments in musical intelligence. With Emily Howell, I am in constant contact with the program via either words or musical phrases, and or ideas or beats or musical it's a complex interactive process, whereas with Emmy it's a single stroke, hit the return button and see what happens. So it takes me and Emily maybe 2 or 3 weeks to develop a rapport, if you're starting from scratch, to even begin to compose anything that even vaguely sounds like what most of us would call musical sensibility. And I'm reaching in constantly, trying to change her mind about things and move it in a certain way. Now, the difference is that the process, similar to a neural net that I use, is that I can coerce her gently towards a certain direction, but the actual weights on the various nodes in the system, the changes of those are very, very tiny, and thus it takes me a long time to get from point A to point B. For example, to convince her what her name is, and then change her name, or to convince her what my name is at the very beginning, because you can actually communicate verbally and musically, not simultaneously, but during the same process. And
Emily Howell has spoken. Let me read a quote of hers. Why not develop music in ways unknown? I am not sad. I am not happy. I am Emily. You are Dave. Life and unlife exist. We coexist. I do not see problems.
Wow. Where'd you get that from?
From your website.
Oh.
Which I mean, the wonderful thing is, so everything you do is experimentally oriented, which is valuable and rare in the field of music. You're not theory led. You're creating this algorithmic music, and then other people, and they do come in along with you and theorize about what it implies and where we might go to get new discoveries. But you're not somebody who's sort of just picked a team and is sorting it out. And in light of that, it's especially cool to me that quote sounds so much like the Tao Te Ching.
I've never made the. Well, I mean, I still don't even remember the quote. So life and unlife exist. We coexist. I do not see problems. And then in the Tao, pots are fashioned from clay, but it's the hollow that makes a pot work. Right. Existence makes a thing useful, but non-existence makes it work. Yep. Interesting. I should tell your listeners that, in fact, Emily, when it begins, has no idea even what language I'm going to use. It has no stored reference points, nothing. So the initial statements I make are replied to as gibberish, and it stays gibberish for quite a while before I can sort of train her gently towards the meanings of things. But since it begins randomly, every time I begin the program, it's different. And musically, that's the same way it works, never predicting what the outcome's going to be. Yeah, I should add here that if your listeners really want to get creeped out,
please.
I've written, I'm on my 16th novel now, and the first 3 novels that I wrote are about an archaeologist and a woman he meets whose name is, of all things, Emily Howell. And in those 3 books, the first one of which is called The Death of Karl and Mulray, all of Emily's lines are written by the program itself. So I had to write the novel inside of Emily Howell, and then ask her essentially what she would say at a certain point. And then I had to run it 3 or 4 times before I got, and then whenever I got something that really, truly related to what was going on, I just used it verbatim. So you can look at her lines in the book and actually see some of the slight discontinuity that exists between either a question that Doug Cassidy, the main character, the archaeologist, says, and what her answer is, which are sometimes not exactly lined up in a way you'd want to, simply because, all those lines by Emily Howell were written by Emily Howell, the computer program.
Wow, this is clearly work that people are going to need some time to catch up with. It's
well, I enjoy it. I enjoy the all the various arts that I'm involved in, and to some degree sciences that I'm involved in, and I tend to love to sort of mix them together at times in ways that I find interesting to see what will happen. And sometimes I use them, and sometimes they're ultimate and consummate failures. But it's, as a 74-year-old man, I must say that I'm having the time of my life with all of this. And I am very sad for those who can't see the, some of, at least, I think, interesting, I won't say important, but interesting aspects of my work, and enjoy it for what it is.
There's a story from Tinman that's is just very interesting to me. I'd like to ask you about. In 2001, before visiting Hearst Castle, you started dozing off in a car and had a, quote, vision that unsettled you about zebras.
Yep.
Could you tell that story?
Oh, it's easy. I mean, my wife was shopping and I was waiting, and we were about ready to return home from Cambria, which is south of the Hearst Castle. And I had this strange dream, or whatever you might want to call it, of a line of zebras walking along, not along the road, but somewhere, maybe a mile in or maybe less than a mile, and nose to tail, as if this was the way zebras marched, or whatever. And it was so real that I just couldn't believe it. And so I told my wife about it as we got into the car and left Cambria and went up by Hearst Castle. And I should just tell the audience, if they don't know, that Hearst, when he built his famed castle along the coast, also included a zoo full of many different types of animals, giraffes, lions, etc. And a lot of the zoo animals, mostly zebras, which were suited for the to the weather along the coast there, remained alive. They're sort of relatives of horses. And sure enough, as we passed, there was a line, I don't know, of at least 20 zebras, nose to tail, absolutely and perfectly in marching order. And she claimed that I'd heard this from a radio station or something, and I hadn't. The radio was not on while I was standing next to the car, dreaming this. And I don't give it any importance particularly. I mean, it's just one of those things that the zebras could have been there and might not have been there. It was just a curious coincidence that they happened to be there. Although I write the story as I recollect, I haven't read that book in many years. I sort of leave that open to the reader as to whether they think I'm really talking about some kind of a seance or some kind of a as you say, vision. I'm not particularly someone who believes in such things, although this one came close to making me a believer. It was a fun experience.
You present an anomaly.
Yeah. It happened.
The anomalous thing the scientific thing to do is to acknowledge anomalies and not to sideline them.
Absolutely.
On a similar note, there's a story about sort of an event that oddly recurs, where you climbed by yourself to the top of a mountain in the sunny slope area of Phoenix, and then picked up a rock and then brought it to a friend who, you don't go into detail, but they're having some sort of hard time in life, and said, I got you the top of the mountain.
Right.
And they broke down. And then in 93, you had a health emergency and were in the hospital, and your son did the same thing to you, and brought you a rock, I think from the same area. And you said,
no, actually, it was in California, but he brought me the rock at the top of Mount Dana, which is the highest mountain on your right as you leave Yosemite National Park to the east side of the Sierras. But the idea that both rocks were the highest rocks of the mountain on which they sat was the common link there. And then you want to finish the story.
And you said, "Oh, how nice of you to remember this story that I told you of what I'd done for somebody." And he said, "I don't know that story. You never told me that. I was just doing this."
Yeah. Things like that happen, and I think they happen to everybody. Although I think that most people don't pay attention as much to them as I suppose I do, and I do, but not because of their importance. It's just for their curiosity. Again, the fact that these coincidences of humongous, potentially large importance, and having their possibility of occurrence being so incredibly minimal in nature that it just seems, but one could argue that I did tell my son that story and he forgot, but part of him remembered enough to do it. And one could argue that somebody else's car radio was on, and I heard somebody announce the zebras marching in a row because the zebras had attracted quite a few people. Because we weren't the only ones to stop our car along the road and stare at the assemblage of these striped animals in the middle of the American West Coast. So there are ways to explain them. I leave it to the reader.
Yeah, I don't want to repeat myself, but to somewhat do that. Carl Jung has written about synchronicity.
Oh yeah,
which is very interesting until he veers off and insists that he's figured it out and that it has to do with astrology. Yeah. And then there's the 12th monkey phenomenon.
Yep.
And and there's parallel evolution. If we're all algorithmic, perhaps even our thoughts in some way can arrive at similar points, and that
we remember through our DNA. In other words, that there are memories. Not only is our nose bent this way or that because of our DNA, but our minds have been bent this way or that based on memories that flow through thousands of generations, and that things that that our great squared ancestors from the past, from the Paleolithic age, they wouldn't be then, but you know what I mean, ancient times are still alive in us today, and that's why we do certain things the way we do them, and remember certain things that never happened to us.
I think a genetic collective unconscious is plausible, and I think that the culture of science, as I've observed it, has fallen into the sort of authority fallacy way too much, and it's seen as this sort of book of right answers, but such phenomena are not on their face beyond investigating, and I think potentially connect to issues of originality that your work raises. But
well, science relies almost exclusively on empirical, reproducible data and experiments, and I would argue that it needs to do that. I mean, that's what its primary objective is to achieve the truth rather than an approximation thereof, or a guess thereof, or a theory thereof, it does its job, but that doesn't mean, as you point out, that there aren't other points of view on these issues that should be taken seriously. After all, science originated in philosophy, and philosophy is more or less what you're talking about when you talk about these things that are not unquestionably unprovable, but certainly questionable in themselves, that science doesn't seem to take seriously. Although these days, I don't know. I mean, with quantum physics producing all kinds of strange behavior at the microscopic, subatomic level, there are quite a few scientific books or books written by scientists with repute that suggest behavior of types that we all, even non-scientists, would have trouble swallowing. That is, the world doesn't really exist. It only, we create it through our own consciousness, all deriving from the so-called double slit experiment that took place originally in the mid-19th century, and then grew in the early part of the 20th century, in the 20s primarily, to produce the idea, at least, that we're able to change our environment without necessarily touching it, moving it, only by our thoughts.
Well, you've said music is a science through mathematics, which makes you a scientist.
Well, it makes me a person with a scientific bent, yes.
I think that's a good note to end on. I like to actually, get music in here as much as one can.
Sure.
Perhaps, is there a piece of yours, perhaps an original composition, not algorithmic, that you would want to introduce right now, and then I could put it at the end?
Well, like all of my compositions, Transcendence was composed algorithmically, not by using either of the two programs we've discussed on this program, Emily Howell or Emmy, but by what I usually do when I compose myself, which is simply consider the possibilities and begin writing code, which I think is essentially composition, and then try things out until something works, and I feel very strongly about it, and then give it a title, and it's a piece. So sometimes these pieces are written in relatively short periods of time. Other times they take a long period of time, as with any composer. But I'm always sitting at a computer keyboard as I write them, except the time that I spend beforehand thinking through things. But even there, I'm thinking through algorithmic things. So the process is very much the same in all of the cases, and it would certainly be the same in this case. And I challenge anybody to listen to the part of the piece. It's not all there, and not have a reaction to it, and I don't know what that reaction will be, but I can pretty much guarantee you that it's not the reaction I had when I wrote it, which I will remain silent about and not give away, shall we say, any of my own feelings in the matter.